You know, back in the 80s, when I first came here as your minister, we struggled with music. You know, I mean, there were Sundays when I would show up and I wasn't sure if we were going to have a pianist or not. And believe it or not, I would leave the congregation and, you know, singing, and don't have to explain where that went. But, you know, it was hard. And now, you know, Justin and Cara, just incredible. Just. It is so great. It really helps to have good musicians. Many of you know that for over 2 decades, I have shared a ministry with the Unitarian Universalist Church of the Philippines. And for those of you who didn't know, yes, we have congregations in the Philippines. We have one in Manila, and then we have 400 miles south of Manila on the island of Negros. We have over 25 congregations. And there's a long story about how all of that happened, and you can buy my book as a Kindle and read about that history. But it really is quite amazing, and most people do not know that there is this Unitarian Universalist presence in the Philippines. It wasn't long after I started that ministry that I realized just how little I knew about our nation's colonization of the Philippines, the world's second largest archipelago. 7,000 islands, over 40 dialects. So if you ever wonder why the Philippines has so much problem, I mean, not only are there the usual kinds of problems like graft and, you know, assassinations and stuff, try to imagine governing 7,000 islands with 40 languages. I mean, my goodness. And if that weren't enough, I also learned about the significant roles that Unitarians and Universalists, our faith ancestors, had played during that era. And so I felt compelled to learn about them, just as you might feel compelled upon learning of some ancestor of yours that did this or did that, and you would want to know more about them. Well, I wanted to know more about these Unitarians and Universalists who participated in the colonization of the Philippines. Now, after 20 years, and with this congregation's gracious support and my family's love and attention, my research and writing project was finally published last month. And you can buy a copy of it out in the foyer. As can happen, projects of this sort meet all kinds of detours, frustrating dead ends, wrong turns without a writing GPS that lead in so many different ways, and a lot of wasted time. And then, oh yeah, there were the 20 publishing houses that rejected my manuscript. But now it's finally done. And my subject. I was searching for an explanation, an answer, as to why Unitarianism and Universalism had such a large number of people leading and supporting American imperialism. When I started this project, I couldn't imagine that this was something our faith ancestors, my people, would participate in. But it turns out that I was pretty naive to even start to think that, because it was all true. And so I wanted to learn why. What was it about our faith values that inspired these Unitarian and Universalist imperialists? Now, just for those of you who are semantic professionals, sometimes I combine Unitarian and Universalist, and sometimes I speak about Unitarian Universalism. Just remember that at the time I'm talking about, there were 2 separate religious organizations, the Unitarians and the Universalists, who didn't merge until 1961. But sometimes I get so used to talking about Unitarian Universalism that I forget to separate the 2. Just be aware of that. I wanted to know whether or not their faith values are still important to us today, as Unitarian Universalists and as Americans. And as I shared my research findings with friends and colleagues, even family members, I was not getting the kind of support that I thought I deserved, the kind of support that I wanted to hear. In fact, some urged me to drop the whole project. Why? Because it was too negative. It was a story, actually it was a lot of stories, that highlighted a very dark period in our nation's history. Actions supported by many in our faith. I was sharing with many this morning that when we first colonized, it was the first time that outside of the United States that we had colonized another people. And our leadership didn't know what to do. Was there a model for colonization? So they went to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Yeah, exactly. How do you do this, they said. And you can read about that in my book. And when that didn't work out, who do they go to? They go to the British. So imagine how that worked out. So they were kind of treading into this territory, this mindset that they had no idea what they were doing. Some of my people suggested that it might be best just to focus on all of the good stuff, whatever that was, the kind of stories that would put us and our nation on the right side of history. Well, that advice sounds a lot like what's going on in our country today. As you likely know, there has been a deliberate and intense effort to remove all the public presentations that threaten the Make America Great Again agenda. For example, one target was public broadcasting, and as a casualty of their defunding will be the show The American Experience, a program that highlights our past and how that history has shaped our present. The changes and restrictions demanded and codified by the White House are leading to a selected, homogenized, and incomplete historical record, not only as presented in documentaries, but in school textbooks, in classroom curriculum, in museums, libraries, and get this, even in archives. The intentional and calculated process of disremembering so-called difficult knowledge, that is, removing the historical threads of our common life that are too challenging for some to hear. This all started years ago and is now moving forward at breathtaking speed. As authoritarianism leverages its posture of fear and abuse, the process of disremembering and revisionism are among the early steps taken to legitimize power, seek retribution, and then marginalize and minoritize those seeking and sharing historical truth. And so as I wrote my book, I couldn't ignore the dangers before us. The words and actions of today are not only reminiscent of, but often identical to what our nation's leaders proclaimed during the era of U.S. imperialism. And to my dismay, what our Unitarian and Universalist faith ancestors also believed. So one example of this overlapping, what I think of as the intertwiningness of our government policy and our Unitarian Universalist faith. I shared in mid-August when I was the UU Minister in Residence at the Chautauqua Institution. How many of you are familiar with Chautauqua? Good. Don't ask me to explain it. It's hard to explain. What I will share is that many of you also know that the Chautauqua program is renowned for showcasing the big names from the arts, sciences, religion, and politics. And I assure you, that's not why I was there. As I prepared my Sunday Chautauqua sermon, I read up on some of the marquee names from the past, and it didn't surprise me to learn that one of our favorite presidents, William Howard Taft, was there in August of 1904. It was reported that in anticipation of his talk, one of the largest gatherings of that era assembled. Taft was there not as President of the United States, that was still 5 years away. He was there as Teddy Roosevelt's Secretary of War, a job that he held for 4 years. Now, in my research, I've discovered, and perhaps I will go back and research this, and I don't know who would read this, but Unitarianism and Universalism had a preponderance of secretaries of war for the United States. The title of his address, of Taft's address, was Our Duty in the Philippines. You see, it hadn't even been a year since Taft had returned from his 3-year appointment as the nation's first civilian governor of our new colony. And who better to explain to his white Protestant, well-educated audience the reasons why benevolent imperialism was going to be a good thing? I mean, who better to explain it all than the person who had played a leading role in creating and implementing recolonization? Yes, recolonization. Because in spite of the Filipinos' fervent dream that the U.S., upon defeating Spain in order to liberate them from Spain's oppressive religious political rule, that they were going to deoccupy them, they were going to live and give Filipinos their freedom. And what happened was just the substituting of one colonial authoritarian power for another, which is to say the U.S. recolonized the Philippines, making a transition that gave birth to the descriptive adage of Filipino political and cultural history as 300 years in a Catholic monastery, 50 years in Hollywood. Today, one of my deepest and most troubling concerns as we witness the disremembering of a complete and accurate telling of our U.S. historical narrative is that we risk losing sight of a fundamental paradox that has shaped our country. How did a nation born in revolution against British colonization then flip the script and colonize black bodies through slavery, subjugate people of indigenous nations across North America, and occupy and colonize foreign lands abroad? And for UUs, how were we involved? Maybe some of you know that Taft was a Unitarian, a faith that was a valued part of his life, from his birth and childhood in Cincinnati to when he lived and died in Washington, D.C., where he was a member of All Souls Unitarian Church. He was not the only one of our faith ancestors committed to colonial benevolent imperialism. Colonial benevolent imperialism. Now, there's a phrase chock full of contradictions and used by nearly every colonizing power who claims that their colonization is going to be different. Turns out that Unitarian Universalism had a disproportionately large number of our faith ancestors who supported the overthrow of the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893. In fact, the ambassador who helped to stir up all of the actions that led to the overthrow of the Queen was a Universalist minister. And then the recolonization of the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico in 1900. Not just individual Unitarians and Universalists, but also corporate support, which is to say that up and down the UU family tree, from congregations and their clergy to national leadership and affiliate groups, in depths and breadths, Unitarian Universalists like Taft and the many others who created and implemented colonial policy, their benevolent intentions were guided by their liberal religious faith values. And the more I learned about this era and the role that we played in it, the more my curiosity grew. I wanted to know what our faith ancestors believed. I mean, what faith values did they hold? Why did they think that imperial hegemony and colonization was acceptable, even righteous, that it was okay? What did our liberal faith have to say about it, or fail to say about it? And perhaps the most annoying question, the one that interrupted my sleep and wouldn't let go, are the faith values that inspired these imperialistic and colonizing ancestors, are these faith values still important to us today? Are they woven into the fabric of our religious life? And what about our nation? I'm going to share with you some insights and conclusions, what I think the faith values were that inspired religious liberal imperialism. And as you listen, I ask you to keep in mind two additional things. First, do any of these faith values sound familiar? Do they express some version of your own religious values, what you hear from our clergy and friends? And second, Do any of these values reflect 21st century American religious political values, which is to ask, are these values still shaping American power? So there is no doubt in my mind that a religious belief built on the foundation of individualism, and that's the clearest and the overriding value inspiring our faith ancestors, expressed as the so-called rights of personal freedom, happiness, and self-determination. We see these in the country's founding documents and supporting letters, written many times by Unitarians and Universalists. Today, many religious liberals think of individualism as a quintessential part of their UU faith. I mean, I have heard thousands of reasons why people came to this congregation, why they came to Unitarian Universalism, and almost always I hear something that sounds like the freedom to believe, the freedom not to be told what to believe. I wanted a creedless church. All these reflections of individualism. A recent expression of these assumptions was captured in a magazine cartoon that shows a couple sitting on a sofa having a conversation, and in front of them is a coffee table with two filled glasses and a wine bottle, suggesting the informality of their conversation. And one of them is saying to the other, okay, you tell your truth, but then I want to tell my truth right after. The freedom to know and articulate one's truth is fundamental to American individualism, and it's a basic ingredient to religious liberal beliefs. In fact, many introductions to Unitarian Universalism, and I did this all the time, was to show how religious individualism can be traced back to our transcendentalist faith ancestors. And we usually would hold up Ralph Waldo Emerson, whom I call Saint Emerson, the sage of Concord. But what he and others were urging was a recognition of individuality, not individualism. Individuality, as Emerson spoke about it, was a sacred gift that recognized the uniqueness of every person, of every living thing. And this uniqueness is to be respected and celebrated. But individuality didn't fit the American mind in those days, in the 1850s and 60s, and even post-Civil War, especially with the genocide of indigenous people, with American slavery, and with the rise of the Gilded Age. What we got instead was a corrupted understanding, a rights-based individualism that supported those in positions of power and dominance. And I'm afraid, unfortunately, that not a lot has changed with that philosophy. The second value inspiring our faith ancestors was their enthusiastic embrace of modernity. For decades, thinking of ourselves as a modern liberal faith has been one of the ways that we've distinguished ourselves in the pantheon of religions. We believed, and still do, that the rejection of orthodox religious beliefs meant leaning heavily into freedom and reason and into science. But this led to what I refer to as one of the better phrases I've come up with, I think, a seduction of the sound of science, a scientific corruption that justified imperialism. And that justification went by the name of eugenics. Unitarian Universalist clergy and congregation, our assemblies and elected officers, our seminaries and our presses, Skinner House and Beacon Press, they all supported a variety of eugenics-inspired programs and personalities. Now, of course, we weren't the only ones doing this, but someone else is going to have to write all those other histories. Just because so many were supporting it doesn't mean that it was okay. Maybe this isn't surprising, but what is alarming was how many Unitarians and Universalists supported it. Quite a large number for such a small faith community. This is an historical fact that I can comprehend and explain, which by that I mean I can get into the heads of the early 20th century Unitarians and Universalists and begin to connect the dots. But putting aside the context, these truths are difficult to acknowledge and negotiate. I want to put it this way. I wish that our chapter, this chapter of our religious history, simply did not exist. I wish it wasn't there, but it is. And when I began sharing some of this with my friends and colleagues, several suggested I simply not write about it, that it was too dark. It was deeply disturbing, even painful. And it is. I gave my manuscript, an early copy of my manuscript, to a colleague, and he spent at least a full 5 minutes apologizing to his congregation for what they were about to learn. I felt affirmed by a colleague who, as we were standing out here in the lobby, we were waiting to process at an ordination in this sanctuary, and I was quickly telling her about my research and the resistance I was encountering, which is also a reason why you never want to invite me as a dinner guest. And as we waited, she had the composure not only to listen to me, but to paraphrase some thoughts that she had co-written in a book. She called it the messiness of the pure past and the hoped-for future. The messiness of the pure past and the hoped-for future. In her book, she wrote, "History shapes who we are. We have some measure of choice in how we express it in our own lives, but how we creatively transform it is the greater responsibility. We cannot lament and transform what we reject or deny or refuse to engage." What she was telling me was, disremembering is not a way forward. Disremembering is not a way forward. This recognition and naming of lamentation and transformation led me to the final theme I want to share with you. And there were 5 altogether, but I had to cut those other 2 out. It's the disturbing absence of humility. My experience is that we Unitarian Universalists are not a very humble people. And our faith ancestors who created, implemented, and sustained imperial policies were no different. Religious liberalism's hubris has been a significant obstacle and deterrent to decolonizing our imperial mind and posture. What is often alarming is that, at least to me, it's so obvious, and we still don't recognize it. I'm reminded of a drawing, another cartoon, that illustrates the lack of awareness that comes with hubris. The image shows competing candidates addressing supporters at a rally. And everyone, including the candidates, is standing and sinking in a pond of quicksand. In fact, some of the attendees have already succumbed, and all that remains visible is the top of their heads. And one of the candidates, with an angry face and a finger pointing at his bewildered rival, is shouting, "As usual, my opponent is playing the quicksand card while ignoring the real issues facing ordinary people today." Among those whose arms and hands are still visible, they're all clapping. One of the messages in this cartoon is that there will always be those who believe that they have a vested interest in being right, regardless of what the circumstances tell us. Hubris stops us from stepping back and seeing the wider view. So what can we do? Actually, we've been given an opportunity to reconsider the values that led and shaped the religious liberal colonial mind. This opportunity started 2 years ago, when after several years of study and meetings, our General Assembly, that is the annual meeting of thousands of representatives from our congregations, voted to adopt new language describing the purposes and values of our faith, one of which is JPEG. And now in the amended bylaws and rules, it states that a primary purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is healing historic injustices. This is what Sophia Betancourt, our UUA president, is talking about when she writes, and Jane read, "Our pressing task now is to ask ourselves and each other, how this understanding calls us forward, individually and collectively. We may agree that love is central. What does that mean to us? And what does it require of us? As a faith community, what does love mean to us? And what does it require of us? For me, Unitarian Universalism's participation in our nation's imperial era qualifies as an historic injustice in need of healing with a liberating love. And I have no idea how that's going to be done. What steps have to be taken? How do you apologize to a nation? How do we apologize to Puerto Rico, to Hawaii? But I believe we have to start a consideration somewhere. British novelist Zadie Smith has asked, what do we want history to do to us? What do you want? Which is the reflection question for this morning on your card. What do you want history to do to you? I believe this is a question we need to be asking and answering. What I want for Unitarian Universalists and Americans is to acknowledge our imperial history. Then, informed by the themes and lessons we discover, I want us to decolonize our imperial mind. Ever cautious of the truth and the adage that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, I want Unitarian Universalists and our nation to compose a song with love as its foundation, whose lyrics and rhythm do not mimic our historical tunes. With a liberating and transforming love, I want us to inspire and welcome an inclusive path forward, a path with love at the center. Let us make it so. Amen.